In case you haven't watched part 1, out-of-place artifacts, also known as ooparts, are artifacts so bizarre that their existence can't be explained without fundamentally altering history. Today we'll investigate a 16th century Ottoman map which seems to depict Antarctica, supposed alien baby mummies from Peru, and a Viking penny found in Maine, along with much, much more. But a lot of these ooparts are far from being genuine, and are either fanciful misinterpretations of otherwise normal objects, or straight up hoaxes. That's why I've decided to fit every single entry on this iceberg into one of 3 different categories: misinterpretations, forgeries, and genuine ooparts. So without further ado, let's dive back down into this iceberg. The Piri Reis Map. The Piri Reis Map was discovered, or rather rediscovered, in November of 1929 within the Ottomans' Topkapi Palace in Constantinople as it was being converted into a new museum. It was discovered by chance in a bundle of old maps by the museum's director Halil Ethem Eldam. The map was made in 1513 by Piri Reis, an Ottoman corsair, cartographer, and admiral, which is what Reis means, and it wound up in Topkapi Palace because Piri Reis had gifted it to Sultan Selim I in 1517, not in Constantinople but in Cairo, because Selim had just conquered it from the Mamelukes. It's sorta considered an out-of-place artifact because, as you can see, it depicts South America in extraordinary detail, making it arguably the oldest detailed map of the Americas, despite being from the middle of the Ottoman Empire. It's not the oldest surviving map of the Americas, period. There are actually 4 older Western European ones, but it is the only map of the 16th century to depict South America longitudinally correct in relation to Africa. And interestingly, it might even be the first map to depict the area around Rio. But most extraordinarily, it's tied directly to Christopher Columbus. Originally, the map depicted the whole world, but it's estimated that the surviving chunk of it is only a third of its original size. In one of the many handwritten notes along its margins, Piri Reis wrote that his map is a collation of 20 older maps, including a map drawn by Colombo in the western regions, which he explicitly states are where the coasts and islands on this map are taken from. This refers to the now lost map that Christopher Columbus himself drew of the New World on his 3rd voyage, and then sent to Spain for safekeeping in 1498. Helpfully, Piri Reis also explained how he was able to get his hands on such valuable info. His uncle, Kamal Reis, another admiral who had a corsair fleet which marauded around the Christian lands of the Mediterranean and which Piri Reis had enlisted in at just 12, had a Spanish slave who happened to have been on 3 of Columbus's voyages and is implied to have kept Columbus's map with him. As a result, Piri Reis's map also includes a little summary of Columbus's journeys, including descriptions of encounters with hostile arrow-shooting natives, cannibals, and big snakes, and even mentions how Columbus's crew gave Caribbean natives glass beads in exchange for food and gold. Interestingly, Piri Reis's description of Columbus's story also includes how he was inspired to go west by reading a book describing far-off riches, which has to be Marco Polo's description of Asia, right? Which is sort of ironic because Columbus's whole point in going west was to find a route to Asia that would circumvent the Ottomans. But if you've been looking at the map, you've also probably noticed how the coast of South America past southern Brazil just curves eastward into a weird big lump of coast at the bottom of the map that sort of looks like Antarctica. And if that really were the case, then this would really be an out-of-place artifact, because the first recorded sighting of Antarctica took place in 1820. But unfortunately, it probably isn't Antarctica. First, it's depicted as being totally free of ice, which is like Antarctica's #1 defining quality. Also, Piri Reis explicitly describes it as being full of spices, weird 6-horned oxen, snakes, and describes it as being very hot, which Antarctica definitely is not. In 1966, a guy named Charles Hapgood published a book entitled Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, with the Piri Reis map, of course, on the cover, in which he claimed that that big lump of coast on the bottom of the map is indeed Antarctica. And the reason why it's ice-free is because the map was originally devised by some super ancient, super advanced lost civilization that existed all the way back when Antarctica was last ice-free, even though that was like 34 million years ago. Other fringe theorists have tried their hand at reading into the map too. In his notorious 1968 book, Chariots of the Gods, Eric von Daniken, the guy who came up with the ancient astronaut theory, claimed that the map's so insanely accurate that there's no way that people in the 16th century could have possibly created it. So you know who made it? Aliens, that's who. Yeah, he genuinely believed that the Ottomans were in contact with aliens. But you still gotta remember, the map isn't actually that accurate, and it's actually pretty shoddy in places. Let me list some of the inaccuracies. Cuba is made a part of the Asian mainland, just like how Columbus wanted it to be, and the vertical, thick depiction of Hispaniola on it is probably based on older depictions of Cipangu, i.e. Japan, as on the Martin Bayham map of 1492. The map also has completely fictional places on it, like a fake Caribbean island called Antillia. So if this bit of coast on the bottom here is really supposed to be an accurate portrayal of Antarctica, then why is it attached to South America? Why is Argentina just gone? And there are multiple other more reasonable explanations of it. It might be a depiction of the mythical Terra Australis, a non-existent landmass in the southern hemisphere, which comes from the ancient Greek idea that all the land in the northern hemisphere had to be balanced out by land in the southern hemisphere. It might also be a non-existent assumed continuation of South America, but there might be a political angle to it too. The notes that Piri Reis wrote next to this chunk of coast explain that it had been explored by the Portuguese, and that the features on it had been taken from the maps of Portuguese infidels, and he explicitly states that he used 4 Portuguese maps to make his map. So this might have originally been Portugal's attempt at trying to get more land, because the Pope-ordained Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494 limited Portugal's claims in the Americas to everything east of a certain demarcation line, which didn't leave them with that much. Plus, it wasn't unusual for cartographers to adjust the coastlines they were working with to fit the surfaces they had available, and Piri Reis was working on a very special material, gazelle hide. And finally, I should probably mention that there are actually far more accurate Ottoman world maps from later on in the 16th century, like this one in the Ali Makar Race Atlas. Piri Reis himself actually made a second world map from 1528 to 1529, this time on camel hide, and even though only a sixth of it actually survives, it's clearly way more accurate. The surviving fragment covers the Atlantic coast of the Americas from Venezuela to Newfoundland, and even includes southern Greenland. It also includes a bunch of features left out of his more famous map, like Florida and the Yucatan. But unfortunately, Piri Reis himself ultimately came to a rather ignominious end. In the early 1550s, in his late 80s, he led an Ottoman fleet which fought the Portuguese off India, and he wound up retreating to Egypt. He was then accused of fleeing from battle to save himself and his lifetime's worth of stolen pirate booty, so the Sultan ordered him beheaded. Despite being popular with Turkish nationalists, his famous map was kept in storage and wasn't actually on display at Topkapi for a long time, but in 2021 it was actually put on display in the Sultan Ahmed III Library, where I think you can still see it. So even though Piri Reis's map has been wildly misinterpreted, it's still a genuine 16th century map with genuine historical significance. And even though it doesn't depict Antarctica, it's still pretty out of place, so I'll put it in the genuine category. But do you know what else is also genuinely significant? Keeping yourself safe online with the sponsor of today's video and my go-to VPN, Private Internet Access. In case you don't know, a virtual private network, or VPN for short, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel, shielding your digital life from the prying eyes of the people otherwise able to exploit your private information at will. Whenever you connect to the internet on a public Wi-Fi network, hackers connected to the same Wi-Fi network have the ability to steal your personal data with ease. But Private Internet Access protects your personal data by encrypting your internet connection through their world-class server infrastructure, making your valuable personal information entirely off limits to the creeps willing to exploit it. Another reason why I like Private Internet Access is that it's the world's most transparent VPN provider, and it never records or stores its users' data, which has actually been proven in court. Private Internet Access is also available on all platforms, and you can use a single subscription to protect an unlimited number of devices simultaneously. But my favorite feature of Private Internet Access is that it also allows you to access region-restricted content from all over the world. It works with all major streaming services, so if you want to watch a show that isn't available on streaming services in your country, you can just change your IP address and connect to servers in any of the 91 different countries Private Internet access allows you to choose from, in addition to all 50 US states. It's incredibly easy to use, and with the click of a button, you can travel thousands of miles away. I use private internet access to access great shows that unfortunately aren't available on Canadian Netflix, but are available in other countries, like Steins Gate, which I was able to find on Japanese Netflix. So join the 30 million other people who use private internet access and get control over your digital privacy today with the link in the description below. With it, you can get this genuinely amazing service for 83% off, so it'll only cost you $2.03 a month. On top of that, you'll get 4 months of free service, and on top of that, subscribing is completely risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and their customer support is available 24/7. So what are you waiting for? Get private internet access today, and let's return to more Uparts. The Abydos Helicopters. This refers to what at first glance appear to be ancient depictions of a helicopter and some oddly shaped spaceships, which sort of look like the type of spaceships you see in Star Wars. They can be found decorating an architrave in the famous temple of Seti I at Abydos in Upper Egypt. Some people have claimed that this is evidence of the ancient Egyptians having advanced technology, like the helicopters and spaceships. But if you look closely at the larger hieroglyphic text it's a part of, you'll see that it actually tells another real story about the lengths a certain famous pharaoh was willing to go to in order to preserve his memory. The beautifully decorated temple this is in was begun by Seti I, the second pharaoh of Egypt's 19th dynasty, but he died unexpectedly young, so it was up to his son, Ramses II, to complete the temple and other monuments begun by his father, like the iconic, enormous Apostol Hall of Karnak Temple in Thebes. But Ramses II is notorious for usurping the monuments of his predecessors to boost his own brand, and his own deceased father was no exception. If you look a bit to the left, you'll see that the text the helicopter is a part of ends in a mangled cartouche that shows clear signs of originally being Seti's throne name, Men-Maat-Re, before being usurped by Ramses' throne name, Usur-Maat-Re Seta-Penre, which is fittingly where the name Ozymandias comes from. This is a pretty clear example of what's called a palimpsest, which is when one text is superimposed onto an earlier one, and other examples of Ramses doing this exact same thing to stuff Seti built can be found elsewhere in Egypt, like in the Apostol Hall of Karnak. Nearby, around Karnak's second pylon, he even usurped cartouches his grandfather, Ramses I, had usurped from an even earlier king, Horemheb. But this isn't just something Ramses did. A lot of pharaohs usurped the inscriptions and monuments left by their predecessors, not just him. And it even happened to his monuments. It's also pretty clear that this same process of textual usurpation is what led to the creation of the so-called helicopter to the right of Seti's mangled cartouche, especially because it's another one of Seti's royal titles, just changed to fit Ramses. It's the remnants of his two ladies' name, also called a Nebti name. Seti's Nebti name was something like, "He who renews the burst, powerful of scimitar, who suppresses the 9 bows," a term for Egypt's various barbarian enemies. Ramses' Nebti name has the same vibe, but was a bit different. It's protector of Egypt, who repels foreign lands, so the inscription had to change. The bow, representing the 9 bows, is actually what makes up the helicopter, but it had to be replaced with some arms and a quail to complete Ramses' name. Plus, you can even see the scimitar mentioned in the name a bit to the right. So, unfortunately, the ancient Egyptians probably didn't have helicopters and spaceships, especially because there's no evidence of it beyond these few mangled hieroglyphs, which are actually a pretty good testament to Ramses II's literally monumental ego. To ensure that what he did didn't happen to his own monuments, Ramses even made sure that his reliefs were generally cut extra deep into the rock to prevent his successors from doing what he'd done, but to no avail. Anyways, the Abydos helicopter is pretty much the quintessential misinterpretation, so that's the category I'll put it in. The alien mummies of Peru. Okay, I think we're all familiar with these little guys. These two supposed alien mummies from Peru, with little elongated heads and 3-fingered hands, took the internet by storm last fall, not just because some people believe they're real, but because they're just so funny looking. No offense, aliens. So let me explain what these things actually are, and spoiler alert, they're not actually the mummies of baby aliens. as disappointing as that might be. They first entered the spotlight in September of 2023 when they were presented at a Mexican congressional hearing by a Mexican alien enthusiast and journalist who runs a YouTube account with over 1 million subscribers named Jaime Maussan. Maussan claims that they were carbon dated by Mexico's National Autonomous University, which revealed that they're upwards of 1,800 years old. He also claims that the university identified 30% of their DNA as being just unknown. So where are these bodies from? Well, Maussan and his team are pretty cagey about that and didn't divulge where exactly they were found and who found them, but apparently the bodies were initially discovered in 2017 in a diatom mine near the Nazca lines. Because of course they were. Specifically by looters led by a guy named Mario. Oh, and apparently they were somehow fossilized too. In a shocking turn of events, the Peruvian government was a bit miffed that someone in Mexico was openly flaunting looted mummies, however real they might be, in a foreign country. So they filed some sort of criminal complaint against Maussan. At the Mexican congressional hearing, Maussan was accompanied by a bunch of supposed medical experts. This includes Jose de Jesus Zalque Benitez, the director of the Scientific Institute for Health of the Mexican Navy, who claimed that the mummies had retractable necks and stereoscopic vision, among other things, and Argentine surgeon Celestino Adolfo Piotto, who tried to argue that they were an evolved version of today's human beings and our descendants. So they're not actually proof of aliens, they're proof of time travel. These guys were also accompanied by a letter signed by 11 researchers from San Luis Gonzaga National University in Peru, which states that there was absolutely no human intervention in the physical and biological formation of these beings. Maussan's team also showed off x-rays that showed how the mummies had eggs and metal implants in them, which were made of rare elements like cadmium. In addition to the 2 baby mummies, which Maussan affectionately named Mauricio and Clara, they presented a detached 3-fingered hand, also said to be from Nazca. They also presented pictures of at least 4 more named mummies. Apparently, this little headless one named Victoria is the one that was actually tested by Mexico's National Autonomous University. Not the other 2, but that's okay, because they were apparently found in the same mysterious cave. One of the biggest bodies they've revealed is named Maria. Maria was, of course, also found somewhere in the Nazca region, and apparently it also comes from Mario the Looter. It made a big splash back in 2017 when a program it and Jaime Maussan prominently feature in was released by Gaia.com, that weird new agey streaming service. Which is sort of bizarre because if you look closely at it, you'll see that it's just completely covered in little splotches of dried plaster. In the trailer for their program, various experts try to spin these white dots as some sort of trace of the special treatment which allowed it to be so well preserved. And one guy even tried to claim that turning this color is normal for a body. I would have said that whoever constructed this is pretty talented and that maybe they should just try marketing this as art, but apparently the plaster is just there to hide modifications made to what's probably an actual ancient corpse, or parts of multiple corpses cobbled together beneath it, which is just unbelievably screwed. And then they had the gall to name it. According to Gaia, Maria dates to between 245 and 410 AD, which again is probably explained by there being an actual ancient Nazca human corpse underneath all that plaster. The guy responsible for making these abominations, Mario, was convicted of grave robbing and manipulating bodies in 2022, and his real name is Leandro Rivera. He claimed to have stumbled across a cave filled with artifacts and strange mummies with elongated heads somewhere in the Nazca region, and that he somehow took out as many as 200 of them. He also claims that some eventually wound up in various European countries.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
Like France, Spain, and even Russia, and claims to keep dozens more. In reality, though, Peru's culture ministry said its investigation into Rivera only yielded 2 altered bodies and 2 sets of partial bones. And the footage of them is really grisly. And it's even more of a tragedy and more painfully ironic when you consider that these human remains were stolen from the archaeological reserve of the lines and geoglyphs of Nazca and Palpa, specifically from a hill at a place called Molake. So these might be the mangled remains of the very people who created the Nazca lines, but now their bodies are being manipulated to appear like the aliens that stole credit for them. So the story of these fake alien mummies is intertwined with the real black market trade in real mummies controlled by actual organized crime. As an example, this all-too-real mummy was found being smuggled in a South American version of a DoorDash delivery bag in the Peruvian city of Puno back in February of 2023. I don't even want to get into this. Smuggling networks, which often sell their stuff online now, apparently also sell fake mummies made out of animal bones and paper mache, which seems to be what Senor Rivera here did to make the two famous baby mummies. In October of 2023, Mauricio and Clara turned up in Lima, Peru's George Chavez International Airport in a cardboard box, and then were immediately seized by the Peruvian Ministry of Culture for analysis. I have no idea why one of them is dressed so weirdly. Honestly, no clue. The intended recipient was an unnamed Mexican citizen, so I wonder who that could be. On January 12th of this year, 2024, a group of researchers from the Legal Medicine and Forensic Sciences Institute of Peru's prosecutor's office, wow, that's a mouthful, led by forensic archaeologist Flavio Estrada, held a press conference in which they announced that they're not aliens. In fact, they're actually just Frankensteined out of various animal and human bones glued together and reinforced with paper and metal. Weirdly, the hands are the only parts crafted out of human bones, and the other parts are made with a combination of dog, bird, and other animal bones. Another earlier study from 2021 determined that one of the baby mummies, named Josephina, has a head made out of a llama's brain case based on a CT scan. But even though these alien mummies have been proven to be horrific abominations made out of mutilated body parts, and their creator was convicted for the process of their creation 2 years ago, their saga continues into the present. Just this April, officials from the Peruvian Ministry of Culture and even a detachment of specialized police officers, obviously men in black, interrupted a press conference which Mosan and his associate Joyce Mantilla were hosting that revolved around a pregnant alien mummy, except it wasn't actually there. Mosan named it Montserrat for whatever reason, and on top of that, he named its unborn fetus Raphael. So I can just imagine some guy desperately pedaling away in a bicycle with the fake alien mummy in its basket like an ET, just yelling, "Be free, Montserrat, be free!" She's also apparently part of a new movie by directors Serena DC and Michael Mazzola in association with Mosan, of course, who claim that they have a seemingly plaster-encased 4-foot-tall mummy which just contains a whole new form of DNA, and it even shows signs of being genetically engineered. They even have another 9-foot specimen yet to be analyzed, so I hope their movie does well. Is what I would say if it wasn't about ancient human corpses being masqueraded as aliens. So where else can they go but the forgeries category? The Cocaine Mummies. In 1992, a Bulgarian toxicologist named Dr. Svetlana Balabanova analyzed 9 ancient Egyptian mummies in the State Museum of Egyptian Art in Munich, Germany, using radioimmunoassay and gas chromatography mass spectrometry, often abbreviated as GCMS, a then new technique used to identify certain compounds in people's systems. After analyzing samples of their hair, tissue, and bones, she and her 2 colleagues published a brief 1-page article in the German scientific journal Naturwissenschaften, announcing that she had detected the presence of hashish, which isn't all that surprising, but also tobacco and even cocaine. They all showed signs of cocaine and hashish or sativa use, and only one of them didn't show signs of tobacco use, which is incredibly bizarre because coca leaves and tobacco only come from the Americas, and these mummies date to between 1070 BC and 395 AD. Roughly speaking, of course, millennia before Chris Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Plus, there aren't any written records or depictions testifying to the ancient Egyptians using cocaine or tobacco. This bizarre discovery has generated a lot of debate surrounding its validity and how exactly these New World drugs got into these Old World mummies. There are actually a number of theories explaining their presence that don't involve the existence of a forgotten ancient drug trade between Egypt and the Americas, so let's get into them. First, assuming that this is 100% legit and that these mummies really did consume these substances in life, it's possible that they might have been able to get them from the old world. There are actually species of coca plants in Africa, like the small-leaved coca tree of Mozambique and South Africa. They're just not capable of producing cocaine. There's also a nicotine-rich plant native to Africa with the very on-the-nose name of Nicotiana africana that's endemic to Namibia. Balbanova has claimed that the ancient Egyptians would have been able to easily obtain them by just going down the Nile, but the Nile is pretty far from Namibia, and if they really did reach it, I'm surprised that they never made any references to it, considering how much of a big deal they made out of expeditions to Punt, which is way closer to Egypt. So in other words, Nicotiana africana probably never made its way to Egypt. Some other tobacco variants are found in Australasia, but come on. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Gosford Glyph truthers, but the ancient Egyptians never made it to Australia. I'm sorry. Balbanova's other explanation for the nicotine she found is that there must have been a species of tobacco in the Old World in antiquity that's just gone extinct, but the evidence of that outside of her own findings is pretty lacking. But to be fair, she analyzed a bunch of samples from all over the place in the 90s. She's even claimed to have tested a whopping 3,000 bodies. This includes 134 natural mummies dating to between 600 and 1100 AD from an excavated medieval site in Nubia called Sayala, 115 of the 134 bits of tissue analyzed, and 27 out of 34 hair samples reportedly contained nicotine, and coke was identified in 56 of the 71 individuals analyzed for it. Oddly enough, it was most concentrated in the bodies of 1 to 6-year-old children, which Balbanova explained was due to coca-rich saliva being used to tranquilize rowdy infants, somehow, even though that's not what cocaine would do. She's also supposedly detected nicotine in hundreds of bodies from a number of places outside the Nile Valley, including in remains dating to between the Bronze Age and the Middle Ages from Germany and Austria, and some very old and very new bodies from China dating to between 10,000 and 100 years ago, which would obviously be after the Columbian Exchange. But you gotta wonder why these substances keep showing up in all these different places despite there being no written records testifying to its use. Balbanova's publications have also been criticized for being exceptionally short and for containing some strange numerical inconsistencies. And the study that started all of this in 1992 was just a preliminary communication that was never followed up with a more extensive publication for whatever reason. These oddities have led to people accusing her of falsifying the results she's gotten, and that some of the tests she claims to have done never actually happened. But those are just allegations, so who knows. Drug detection through hair analysis only became an accepted form of drug detection in the 90s, so these tests occurred at a very early stage in the development of this process. It's also been argued that the only way to show that the drugs were consumed by these mummies when they were alive would be to find different concentrations of them at different hair lengths, corresponding to what they consumed over time. In the Munich mummies case, it's also possible that at least the nicotine comes from the food these Egyptians ate. There are actually plant species other than tobacco which produce nicotine but don't have very high quantities of it, and the ancient Egyptians definitely knew of two of them: winter cherry and celery. In a study from 2001, hair samples from 18 mummies from a place called Kelis in Dakhla Oasis in Egypt's western desert were analyzed. 14 of them were found to contain nicotine, but in very low quantities, between 0.7 to 2.1 nanograms per milligram. A nanogram is apparently 1/1000th of a gram, by the way. 2.1 nanograms is also the cutoff point between people who just unknowingly absorb nicotine in their food and smokers, so it's likely that the nicotine in these guys just came from whatever they were eating, or maybe embalmers were tossing celery stalks in people's wrappings, who knows. Some have also argued that chemical decomposition of the substances used to embalm the mummies could have somehow created the compounds that Balbanova detected, because cocaine is an alkaloid, and Egyptian priests used alkaloid-containing plants during the mummification process, so they might have decayed to the point where they resemble cocaine. But that's pretty unlikely, and such a transformation is entirely theoretical. It's also been suggested that some of the mummies that Balbanova tested are actually forged mummies, made out of relatively recent bodies that were used to feed Egypt's booming mumia or mummy flesh trade in the 19th century. when people actually used to eat them and use them as paint and all that other stuff. There's a documentary about the cocaine mummies in which Rosalie David, a curator at the Manchester Museum, tried to locate the cocaine mummies in Munich, but oddly enough, she was prohibited from further analyzing or even filming the mummies on the grounds of religious respect, even though they'd been analyzed and even filmed earlier that same decade. One of the mummies, a lady named Henut Tawi with a beautiful nest of coffins from the 21st dynasty, is definitely real, but the exact origins of the other 8 remain unclear. Rosalie David was able to discover that the other 8 mummies tested consisted of 7 detached heads and 1 incomplete body, though that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't real. Interestingly, after 7 samples taken from mummies from the Manchester Museum itself were tested, 3 tested positive for nicotine, but none tested positive for cocaine. The theory explaining this that I find most probable is that the mummies were contaminated in modern times, which also probably explains why nicotine was found in our old pal Ramses II's mummy during his famous trip to France between 1976 and 1977. Dr. Michel Lescaut of the Natural History Museum of Paris claims that while analyzing Ramses's wrappings, she was shocked to discover the unmistakable remains of tobacco. It was reportedly mixed up with resin used in his mummification, and samples from deep inside Ramses's abdomen also contained tobacco, both suggesting that the plant had been there since Ramses's embalming. Sandy Knapp of the Natural History Museum in London has in turn suggested that it's probably just the remains of something from the wider nightshade family that tobacco belongs to. But let's take it at face value because there's actually a reasonable explanation for as to how it got in there. After seeing Ramses II's mummy in 1907, French author Pierre Lodi commented that it was infested with swarms of bugs, and that the old pharaoh would be treated to a mercury bath to remove them, which was actually a way insects were removed from animals at the time. Tobacco dust also happens to act as an insecticide, which was well known at the time, and it also happens to have been used to get fleas off dogs before also rubbing them down with mercury. So it's likely that the tobacco found in Ramses, assuming it really is tobacco, could have come from when the body was likely treated with it right before it was rubbed down with mercury to kill off all the swarms of bugs infesting it. Another insecticide in use at the time, called pyrethrum, taken from chrysanthemum flower heads, was also found in Ramses. The tobacco treatment might have also been applied to some of the Munich mummies, but there's also a chance that the nicotine found in them could have come from the cigarettes of careless museum goers or even curators, because smoking was of course ubiquitous until people realized it caused cancer. And smoking wasn't banned in most museums until relatively recently. You should also keep in mind that coke was a pretty widespread medicine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Looking at you, Freud, so who knows, maybe a bored German curator decided to try one of the mummies out as a snuff tray. But Balabanova's defenders have argued that she likely cleaned the hair sample she used with solvents, enzymes, or acids before analyzing them, as is standard procedure when analyzing hair for drugs, making contamination a less likely culprit, at least with the Munich mummies. The Munich mummies are the only Egyptian mummies ever determined to contain cocaine, but there are actually some non-Egyptian mummies with way higher concentrations of it, and they're from exactly where you'd expect they'd be, South America. For example, in a 1991 study, 2 of 8 hair samples taken from pre-Columbian Chilean mummies tested positive for cocaine metabolites. And the amount of cocaine detected in the Munich mummies, by comparison, is so negligible that it's actually below the cutoff point between negative and positive identifications. The absence of any records of ancient Egyptians snorting lines and smacking on zins is made all the more damning considering that there is actually evidence of them using other hallucinogenic substances. Starting in the 18th dynasty, they were using opium, which makes sense since they did often depict poppies, and its use is recorded in the famous Ebers medical papyrus. It's also possible that they might have been using the lotus flowers we mentioned when talking about the Dendera light bulb in part 1 as a drug too, but that's a bit debatable. The once widespread but currently rare blue lotus, which is actually a water lily, does contain potentially psychoactive but little understood alkaloids. They also contain lots of bioflavonoids, which have beneficial properties and are also found in herbal remedies like ginseng. But they aren't really high-inducing, they just increase blood flow. Blue lotuses are also mentioned in medical papyri, and Herodotus records Egyptians eating it in Book 2 of the Histories, but in both cases its actual effects go unrecorded. We do know that they also immersed them in alcohol too, but again, we don't know what that did for them. It's also possible that the Egyptians might have smoked weed, but they didn't make any definitive depictions of it, and they didn't leave behind any hemp fibers either. So ultimately, I think that these mummies have been majorly misinterpreted. Runestones in North America. I don't want to spend too much time on these because they're all almost certainly modern forgeries, and right after this I'll talk about what's probably the only real Viking artifact that made it to the US through actual Viking trips to North America. Anyways, these sketchy runic inscriptions have popped up all over the US and Canada, but let's focus on the US first. They've appeared along the eastern seaboard in Massachusetts, Maine, and Rhode Island, but also in Midwestern states like Ohio, Illinois, Minnesota, and even Oklahoma. Authors Alf Mong and O.G. Landsverk have proposed that these various forged runestones are actually elaborate cryptograms like from National Treasure with secret dates on them ranging in time from 1009 to 1362. But actual runologists have pretty much unanimously rejected that hypothesis, and none of these inscriptions are believed to be genuine. I can't cover all of them, but I do feel compelled to talk about the most famous one, a 200-pound stone tablet called the Kensington Runestone, found near the town of Kensington in the state of Minnesota. It was found in 1898 by a Swedish immigrant of all people named Olof Ogham as he was clearing trees on his farm. The runes on it are legible, and they describe how a party of adventurous Vikings from what's now Sweden and Norway was on its last legs after finding that 10 of their men had been killed while the rest of them were gone fishing. It also dates itself to the year 1362, but there are some telltale signs indicating that it's just a modern forgery. First of all, the runes themselves are remarkably fresh and somehow don't show much weathering. It's also filled with words and phrases not in use in Scandinavia in the 14th century, and essentially seems to be a mixture of modern Swedish, Norwegian, and even English. There are also several other weird things about it. For example, unlike other runestones, it lacks lines between its registers, and it has one of the longest inscriptions ever seen on a runestone, despite supposedly being made by a band of explorers close to perishing, desperate to escape. Some have also claimed that it has to be real because it identifies its location as an island, which wasn't an island at the time of its discovery, but was in the past, and it mentions two skerries that could possibly be referencing two big boulders 20 miles away, but that seems like a bit of a stretch. The fact that it was found tangled up in tree roots doesn't really confirm that it's medieval, because the tree it was found under was just around 10 years old, which of course just means that the runestone has to have been made sometime before 1888. Since the guy who found the stone was Swedish himself, it's easy to assume that he's the one to blame for it, but I'm somewhat skeptical of that because he used it as a stepping stone in his yard for several years after its discovery. But he did happen to own a Swedish grammar book published in 1840 which lays out the runes, and he might have had a little interest in them, but the rumors claiming that he was rune crazy or an expert stonemason don't seem to be true. But it was still probably created by one of the many Scandinavian immigrants who settled in the area in the 19th century, and it was probably meant to legitimize their presence there by proving that the Old Norse sagas about Vinland were true and that the Vikings were the first Europeans to reach America. I mean, they were so eager to do so that they funded the construction of a replica of the Gokstad ship and sailed it all the way from Norway to Lake Michigan for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. These Scandinavian immigrants also created Viking leagues in the 1880s and 1890s to further hammer in the point. And the runestone has certainly been embraced and sort of even institutionalized by the people who live around it. It has a whole museum of its own in the center of Alexandria, Minnesota, near to where it was found, which attracts thousands of visitors a year. Alexandria also claims to be the birthplace of America because of it, and erected a colossal 28-foot-tall Viking statue named Big Ole in its honor. In its namesake town, Kensington, it has its own park featuring a quintuple-scale replica of it. There's even a quaint little Catholic church there named Our Lady of the Runestone, because the small Catholic minority of Scandinavians there and the Central European Catholic majority have really clung to it since the Norse were solidly Catholic by 1362, and the stone has Ave Maria on it. They've even claimed that the Vikings used a big rock with some holes in it near the town of Sauk Center as an altar, but I think that's a bit of a leap. In a similar vein, a Norwegian-American historian and runestone advocate named Hjalmar Holland claimed that various holes chiseled into rocks around Minnesota's lakes were left by Vikings, using them to moor their ships, even though you could just, wrap mooring rope around the rocks instead, and ships big enough to need them wouldn't even be capable of getting into Minnesota's small lakes in the first place, and they're probably just blasting holes for dynamite left by 19th century settlers who used them to get stone for foundations. Otherwise, I think the area's enthusiasm for Vikings is actually pretty charming, and it definitely sets them apart, even if the runestone it revolves around is ultimately fake. I also think the supposed runic inscriptions in Oklahoma are pretty interesting, just because the idea that the Vikings ever got there is just so wacky. There's the Heavener runestone, which was first brought to the Smithsonian's attention in 1923 and has its own 55-acre park. Another runic inscription called the Peto stone was found 10 miles away in 1967. But they're both written using two different runic scripts, Elder Futhark and Younger Futhark. The period of transition when they were both in use in Scandinavia occurred between the 7th to 9th centuries. So because they used two different scripts, translating them is impossible, and their runes went out of use way before Leif Erikson ever made it to Vinland. There's also another stone inscribed in Elder Futhark from Oklahoma called the Shawnee runestone, but like the Kensington runestone, all of these Oklahoman runestones don't really show any signs of weathering, and the Peto inscription is basically an exact copy of the Heavener one, just with a few extra runes tacked on. They did inspire a local college's Viking mascot though, so there's that. And I can't forget the fake runestones found right here in Canada. The 400-pound Yarmouth stone was found in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia in 1812, and another now missing stone called the Bayview stone with similar carvings was found in the same area at the end of the 19th century. The nonsense inscriptions on them have mainly been identified as Norse runes, but they've also been identified as early Greek, Basque, even Japanese, and most hilariously, Hungarian. And finally, I just have to mention how some crackpots have misinterpreted basic Native American petroglyphs in Vermont, on islands off the coast of Maine, Boone County, West Virginia, and Baca County, Colorado, as ancient Ogham script. Wait, Ogham is Irish? So if they were real, they'd prove that my ancestors were the first Europeans in the Americas. Scratch that. These Ogham inscriptions are definitely 100% real, unlike the runestones peddled by those Scandinavian wannabes, and they were actually left behind by the Great Celtic Empire, of course centered on Boston, that controlled all of North America until it was destroyed 12,000 years ago during the Finno-Korean Hyperwar. But you wouldn't know that because those bastards, the Normans, destroyed every trace of it, except these lines, which are, again, 100% real, and I am completely unbiased in saying that. Anyways, they were most famously identified as Ogham in America, BC, a book by a Harvard-employed marine biologist named Barry Fell that was first published in 1976. In it, Fell translates these so-called Ogham inscriptions as tombstone labels, autographs of explorers, and parts of temples to the ancient Celtic sun god Bel, or Belinus. It also just so happens that these inscriptions lack any vowels, and a lot of the consonants found in actual Ogham, almost as if they're just misinterpretations of random lines and not actual texts. How strange. America BC is basically just an attempt at creating an overarching narrative out of a bunch of different wacky, dubious claims. Like that, in addition to Ogham, America is filled with inscriptions in Egyptian hieroglyphs, Libyan, Iberian Punic, and even Basque. Most hilariously, it also claims that the Zuni tribe of the southwest are actually descended from Libyan sailors. So, needless to say, I think that these are all hoaxes, but some of them still have their own unique historical significance, and they'll probably remain important to a lot of people for a long time. So, they're not necessarily all that bad. The Maine Penny. Okay, so unlike all the forgeries we just covered, this is an undeniably genuine 11th century Viking artifact. But the main controversy around it revolves around how it wound up where it is now, in Maine. Did it actually wind up there almost 1,000 years ago thanks to contact between Vikings and Native Americans, or was it planted there in modern times? The coin was first discovered by amateur archaeologists Guy Melgren and Ed Rung while excavating a midden on the coast of Maine, specifically at a place called Naskiag Point near the town of Brooklyn in 1956. The midden was just 8 feet above the high tide line on the property of a guy named Goddard, so that site has been known as the Goddard Site ever since. The two amateur archaeologists returned to the site for several years, but during their second summer there, on August 18th of 1957, they found this rather worn, part silver, part copper coin near the center of the site. Melgren decided that it was a 12th century English coin, but strangely enough, he never actually publicized it. Instead, he just showed it off to friends. It only started grabbing people's attention in 1978, 6 years after it was donated to Maine State Museum in Augusta, when a guy named Bert E. Farmer published it in the Bulletin of the Maine Archaeological Society, but he identified it as belonging to Henry II. Ironically, a London-based coin dealer named Peter Seeby saw the picture and recognized it as a Viking coin, so in the same journal he published what it actually is in the spring of 1979. It's actually a Norwegian coin dating to the reign of Norwegian King Olaf the Peaceful, or Kier in Norwegian, who ruled Norway between 1067 and 1093. He was actually the son of Harald Hardrada, and Olaf succeeded him right after he was famously killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge while trying to invade England in 1066. A cross is clearly visible on the reverse, and there's a more enigmatic design on the obverse that's likely a rather abstract and worn attempt at depicting a horse. Seeby's identification spurred leading Norwegian numismatist, or coin expert, Professor Kolbjorn Skar of the University of Oslo to check the coin out in person in February of 1979, and after doing so, he declared it to be genuine, and also believed it to be a genuine find, too. It's similar, but a bit less well preserved than coins from the Gressley hoard, which contained 2,301 coins, making up 2/3 of all coins from the period, which was discovered in 1878 or 79 southeast of Trondheim. Shortly afterwards, in 1881, Laurentius Sturneson fit these different coins into various classes, and the Maine Penny fits in with Class N, which is pretty rare and is only known from 3 other smaller hoards. The Gressley hoard contained 104 identical Class Ns, 41 of which were sold off to museums and private individuals, along with other coins from the Gressley hoard by the University of Oslo in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some eventually even wound up in America, and that's one of the main reasons why some people think that the Maine Penny is just a hoax, and that either Melgren or someone else attached to his digs at the Goddard site deliberately planted a coin that they just bought on the coin market. Melgren happened to be a coin collector and even worked at an auction house. But I mean, people genuinely interested in history and archaeology are the most likely to have coin collections. I have one myself. But he also reportedly had a keen interest in pre-Columbian contact theories involving the Vikings. Also, 2 high-profile books about Vikings traveling to America were published at around the same time as the discovery. The forged Vinland map also came to light in the same year, 1957. That's all just circumstantial though, and remember, Melgren never went out of his way to attract attention to the coin, and initially didn't even know it was Viking. So it's pretty hard to believe that he masterminded a whole hoax surrounding it. Plus, it would have been really difficult for him to get his hands on this particular type of coin. In a 2017 paper, Norwegian numismatist Svein H. Gullbeck argued that the Norse penny cannot have originated from any recorded Norwegian hoard or single find, because the Maine Penny can't be identified with any of the 41 Class Ns sold by the University of Oslo, especially because it's actually a unique variant combining traits from multiple different classes that they wouldn't have sold, and the Class N coins from the three smaller hoards they're known from are all accounted for. Additionally, it can't be a single one-off find because in Norway, medieval coins have to be handed over to and recorded by the state. Damn commie bastards. But you do also have to consider that most coins on the coin market don't come from very well-documented sources. But then again, Gullbeck argues that coins from Olaf's reign are generally so scarce that if an undocumented hoard of them was ever offered on the open market, it would instantly be recognized. They're so scarce in the first place because his coins were pretty debased and didn't really have much silver in them, so they became so unpopular that Olaf's son, Magnus Barefoot, great name by the way, had to demonetize them and withdrew them from circulation. There's also still the possibility that it was found somewhere else in Northern Europe outside of Norway though. Olaf's coins have been found in places you'd expect, like the British Isles, but also as far away as Iceland and even Lebanon. So despite their low silver content, they're arguably a bit more widespread than the coins of other Norwegian monarchs. But that fact could also of course be used to back up the Maine Penny's authenticity. Interestingly, Olaf's coins have been found as parts of so-called offering finds from northern Sweden and Finland left by Lapps, and they were all pierced or had loops soldered onto them, meaning that the Norse probably gave the coins to the Lapps as trade ornaments, probably around 1100, when these sorts of coins had already been replaced in Norway itself. I say that that's interesting because the Maine Penny was also initially pierced, but its weakened rim broke off, only leaving a smooth, rounded indentation. It's also visibly worn from extensive use, and tests conducted using Raman spectroscopy on behalf of Bruce J. Bork, the Maine State Museum's lead archaeologist, revealed that corrosion on the coin was caused by water trickling down around it for ages, and the wear on it couldn't have been faked, though these tests remain unpublished. The fact that Lanzo Meadows, the only known Norse New World settlement, exists, and we know that a gaggle of Vikings under Leif Erikson did actually make it to Canada in the early 11th century, does make accepting the Maine Penny's authenticity a bit more tempting. But the coin's age further complicates its story. It dates to the better part of a century after Leif Erikson's death, around the year 1020, and after the Vinland sagas say that the Vikings left Vinland because of clashes with the natives, but that also simultaneously makes it a strange choice of a coin to plant as fake evidence of Viking contact, especially since it's so rare. A hoaxer could have used an earlier Norwegian coin, or even an earlier Anglo-Saxon or German coin. They were actually the most widespread types of coins in the Viking world at the time, and are now accordingly available at better prices. Also, Professor Skar from earlier published the main reference book on Norwegian coinage just a couple of years before the Maine Penny first attracted attention in 1976, and the original images of the Gressley coins in Stenerson's publication are pretty difficult to get your hands on, like with most old coin catalogs. So why would Melgren plant a coin of Olaf III if he almost certainly didn't know what it was? And there were actual Norse attempts to reach Vinland again in the 12th century, and even afterwards to get timber for colonists in Greenland. In addition, there are even unmistakably non-native metal items from Dorset and Thule culture sites in the far north of Canada. The most notable of them, for us at least, is a bronze balance, similar to ones the Norse used to weigh coins, found at a Thule culture site excavated in the 70s on the northwestern coast of Ellesmere Island, way up in the Arctic and right next to Greenland. Iron, and I repeat iron, boat rivets, woolen cloth, and even chainmail have been found elsewhere on Ellesmere Island, around a place called Skraeling Island, which was the site of a 13th century Thule village. But based on all these artifacts, the Norse were definitely there at some point. There's even this strange 13th century Thule culture figurine from nearby Baffin Island, which might possibly be a native depiction of a Norseman in European clothes, complete with a cross on his chest. And the rest of the Goddard site has revealed some interesting clues, which might point to how the penny got there in the first place. Excavations at the site resumed in 1979 because of interest in the Maine Penny, but no other Norse artifacts have ever been found there. There might be a reason for that, though, because there's a very real chance that the coin wound up there through trade with peoples from much further to the north. It was a major trade center of some sort, possibly the largest village in Maine at the time, and it contained objects from as far west as the Great Lakes and as far north as Labrador. 5% of the stone tools there were made from chalcedonies from the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, and there were also a number of tools made of a special type of translucent stone called Rama chert from northern Labrador. The site also possibly yielded a burin from the aforementioned Dorset culture way further up in the north, which also traded with the Norse at Lanzo Meadows, in addition to in the Arctic, of course. The Goddard site has actually been dated to the 12th and 13th centuries, so it's definitely within the realm of possibility that a Viking coin from the end of the 11th century could have wound up there, maybe after being traded from much further to the north. So after reviewing all of the evidence for and against the Maine Penny being a genuine find, I'm personally inclined to think that it probably is, especially since it isn't actually all that far-fetched when you keep in mind the discoveries made up here in Canada. But the jury's still out, and its true veracity remains uncertain. The circumstances required to get it to the Goddard site, and the circumstances of its discovery are just so odd that you can't really make a snap judgment about it. But ultimately, I'm gonna leave it in the genuine category. So that's the end of the video, but just before I go through my patrons, I want to bring your attention to a GoFundMe page my family is creating for an old friend of ours who desperately needs a kidney. The Canadian healthcare system has really failed her, and it's refusing to give her a new kidney even though the heavily diseased kidney they gave her 2 years ago has already shut down. So she's being forced to find a kidney outside of Canada, which, obviously requires a lot of money. A link to the GoFundMe page will appear in the description as soon as it's ready. I want to thank my incredibly generous patrons, Dhruv Singhal, Booga420, Bajun, Julia Erickson, Harrison Timperley, Doc Bossman, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bomb Tom Badil, Annie Banani, Rose Klein, James Kirk, Hugh DePayne, Alyssa P., Mark Elliott Cullen, Shemek Wierzbicki, Jack Lester, Mithridates, Jake the Snake, Liv Buller, Tyler Doucette, and our new patrons, Inbred Cat, Have a Cigar, Alex Clark, Jess Sullivan, and Akyune.